that everybody could make it tonight. I got a little story about Michael, and Michael had, I think, a lot to do with the book club being born. I think I first met Michael at a small temple education program about 10 years ago. I also met his beautiful bride-to-be, Catherine, that night. Before that, I knew his wonderful mother, Pearl, who had been at Temple Israel for many years and served in many capacities. We also knew her as the Daffodil Lady, because she was always bringing out the daffodils for cancer. She worked for the Cancer Society or volunteered. Moving forward to about 2.5 years ago, one morning on Shabbat, that's Sabbath services, Saturday, we were having a discussion about the Torah reading, and Michael and our president, Josh, started going back and forth and commenting about Jewish history and the Talmudic rabbis of 2,000 years ago. I was really taken aback by the depth of their knowledge. It felt like I was a second grader as far as my knowledge of Judaism history, and they were postdoctorates on the subject. Not long after that, I discussed this with Michael, the fact that he had tremendous in-depth knowledge of Jewish history, and asked him to recommend some readings for myself. He first mentioned a couple books called, one was A Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg, and another one was Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl, and a couple other books. I did wind up reading those books, and I got the idea that we should start a Jewish book club at Temple Israel. We started in February 2020. Ada Kucha and B'nai Birch, who is unfortunately homesick tonight. The three of us really championed the book club at Temple Israel, and we all kind of have our own little strengths, so we're really, we work together well. So we started in February 2020, and it's been really good, as I mentioned. So back to Michael. Most everyone knows he is an attorney and a writer, and I must add, a hell of a researcher and historian. He's published several books, the latest being The Book of Order, which Michael presented via Zoom to our book club about a year ago, and tonight's book, The Hunter of Tel Ashivka. He also is a frequent contributor to In-Depth New Hampshire. So with no further ado, here's Michael to discuss The Hunter of Tel Ashivka. And Michael's going to discuss a lot of questions that we submitted to him beforehand, but feel free to ask any questions. And if you haven't read the book, we're talking about the period 1926 Ukraine, 9 years after the Russian Revolution. So that's the setting. So, Michael?
Thank you, Kenny.
You're welcome.
Thank you for those kind words. So I want to thank everybody here for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Some of you folks know me from work. Some of you folks know me from this synagogue. I'm not sure if I know all of you who are here. Some of you have read this book, some of you haven't. But what you all have in common tonight, honestly, is that you're showing me real kindness. There's a microphone. Pull it up here. Technical difficulties.
I hear every word.
Yes.
What's that? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying that what you all have in common tonight is that you're showing me a kindness by being here. And I would like to return that gesture. I wish I could return it to each of you individually for showing me that kindness. But that's hard to do when you're giving a general talk. I have to sort of speak in general terms. But I will try to do so. I will try to respond to your being here. And the only kindness I can really offer in this context is to share some of my personal thoughts about this book. 3 topics of note come to mind that I think would be of interest. First, how and why I came to write it. Second, a few words about its subject matter. And third, a few words about the idea of writing in general. And then I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I have a few in hand already that Kenny gave to me before from the book club members, but if any of you have questions as well, I'm happy to address those. So as Kenny mentioned to you, this is a book about Russian Jews in the 1920s, 1926 to be exact. And one very simple and valid question would be, why would I write about that? It seems very far away. It seems like a very distant time. My answer is that I was really writing about current events, about certain concerns that I have, about issues that I see all around me. And I wanted to do this in a way that illustrated these things as clearly as I could, to put them into relief, as it were. And they seem to present themselves very clearly in this particular context. The colors seemed extra rich to me. It's also a fact that we can often see things more clearly from far away than we can see them when they're right in front of us. Another thought that I want to share with you, and another reason I had for placing this story so far away in time and place both, concerns the idea of history itself, which is that we typically fail to see ourselves as living in and participating in history. But it helps us understand our lives a little bit better when we cure that myopia and when we consciously place ourselves into some sort of context. That can be very hard to do. We look around ourselves on a daily basis, and there's a natural sense that the world around us has always been the way it is, that any other way is unreal. We can't see it, we can't feel it just isn't there. And for Jewish people, this sense of things has a very particular consequence. If you take a look at what we see as Jews when we look around, you have Reform Jews, and the Reform movement, for those unfamiliar with it, actually includes the conservative movement. This is a conservative synagogue, but the conservative movement is an outgrowth of Reform Judaism. So for the Jewish world, there is Reform Jews, there are Orthodox Jews, and then there are the Hasidic Jews, who we see today as sort of blending in with the Orthodox Jews as very, very observant types. And very sadly, in today's world, we Jews in the Reform movement often give pride of place to the Jews in the Orthodox movement. And the Orthodox do something similar for themselves. They sometimes think of themselves as being the real thing, and other types of Jews as being somewhat less than. We do this for very understandable reasons. We do this because on a daily basis, we all tend to define our Judaism by how much we practice it, how many rites we observe, how much we are or aren't like our own grandparents. The concomitant sense of those who observe more are somehow more Jewish or better Jews. But even though this is understandable, it is also a somewhat pernicious view because it gives strength to the mistaken precept that observance and observance alone is what makes the Jew, which on the one hand is a very limited view of what Judaism is, but on the other hand, and since it's something that concerns me very much because I have a small child that I'm trying to raise in a certain way, this is also a view that highlights one of the Reform movement's main weaknesses, which is its failure to inculcate in its adherents what being Jewish means in the absence of practice, in the absence of following traditions. Whether it means anything more in truth than being vaguely liberal, or reading the New York Times when you eat your bagel on a Sunday morning. It's a question of whether it's an actual thing on its own, or whether it's just the lack of something, whether it's just the lack of being Christian, or sometimes for some people even the lack of being religious, because in America it's Christianity that is the fallback religion of our culture. And if that's all there is to it, then the adherents of Reform Judaism naturally float away, because why wouldn't they? And that itself gives the Orthodox movement real grist for their mill, the fear that if we stop observing, then we stop being Jews and lose what's special about Judaism. Now, here's the thing that concerns me, and what I was writing about, at least one part of what I was writing about in this book. I not only think that Judaism still matters in this world, rather than being something to float away from and something to treasure and value, but I also believe that the Reform movement itself is crucial, historically crucial, for maintaining what I consider the through line of Jewish belief, its animating spark, from the beginning of this faith to today's date. And I would posit that the through line is this, that Judaism validates, regulates, and sanctifies the relationship between individual humans and the divine. And that is something that concerns me deeply, because I am an individual human. Now, as for understanding how and why I believe that this is the through line of Judaism, and why I think the through line, Ruth, the line that goes through it from the very beginning. And so again, from my understanding of why I believe this, and why I think the Reform movement is so crucial to maintaining it, for that I need to do something very daring. And I'm actually in front of two rabbis tonight, and doing this is foolhardy, but I want to take you on a whirlwind tour of Jewish history. Each one of these chapters of Jewish history, you could only write around 300 books about it, and there are around 500 or 700 books written about each one of these things. I'm going to go through it in a matter of moments, which is truly ridiculous. So I apologize beforehand for making a hash out of it. But one thing I want to note is that as a religion, Judaism is an absolute mess. It has never had an agreed upon creed. It has never made sense in any logical way. What it has, however, is a narrative that has been shaped by its history, and a narrative that brings together all of its different strands into one organic whole. You go back all the way to the very beginning of things. Judaism presents what's called a syncretic religion. Syncretic religions are religions that bring together different faiths and combine them. And that's a sort of a strange thing to think about Judaism, which is such an old faith. But there is a belief in academia that Judaism began as a combination of two different strands of thought. You had the Canaanite priesthood in the land of Canaan, which was a typical Near Eastern land with a priesthood and a temple and worshiping certain gods, very ordered and very hierarchical. And then you had a new thing in the world. You had Moses' desert-based monotheism, which was not based on the priesthood, which was based on individuals really listening and thinking about God on their own without any intermediaries. These are two very different precepts. They're two very different ideas of how to relate to the divine. But they were combined in ancient Judaism in a very unique way. So a little tiny kingdom set between much larger empires, and they did something truly unlikely, combining these two strands of belief. And what I would add, any of you, all of you really, who have ever felt any tension between the true spirit of faith and its rote exercise in prayer and ritual, I feel that tension whenever I go to a synagogue, between feeling like I'm just following some recipe and wanting to really connect to something bigger than myself. That tension is at the root of everything in Judaism. Judaism is built on that tension, and everything in Judaism really goes back and forth between those two things. I would also add, as an aside almost, that I consider that to be one of Judaism's unique strengths as a faith, because I myself have gone back and forth over the course of my life, and I think many people do. There have been times when only the abstractions mattered to me, and there are times when the rituals of Judaism were actually very welcome to me. Both annual rituals, celebrating certain holidays, and they're so helpful in making your family a sensible thing, and life cycle rituals, or at somebody's death, at somebody's birth, at your wedding, things like that. Judaism has resources to draw upon for pretty much all of your emotional needs, which is a really wonderful thing. But again, returning to the unfolding of our history and how important history itself has been to making Judaism into the faith that it is, if you move on from that Canaanite melting pot, this bizarre combination of these two very different traditions, and you go into recorded history, you see the same thing happening over and over again. And these are historical events that had a profound impact on Jews and how Jews thought about their faith. You had the creation of the northern and southern kingdoms, and you had the collapse of the northern kingdom, and that led to the rise of prophecy. That led to an infusion of morality into this idea that God exists. That, again, was a very new and marvelous thing in the world, that God was expecting you to be the moral creature. That was a direct result of the prophetic tradition, which itself was a direct result of the fact that the Jewish kingdom split into two under the political stresses of its day. Because when the northern kingdom fell, they tried to make sense out of that. They tried to make sense of the fact that they deserved to fall because they were not being decent people. And you have the fall of the north and south. You have the book of Deuteronomy, which again is a very morally based work, and that is based really on the fall of the northern kingdom. You then have the fall of the southern kingdom, the fall of Jerusalem, and that led to Jews being in exile. The exile of Judaism, of Jews, into the broader world of its day, which is 600 BC or something along those lines. Don't quote that number because it's wrong. But you have Jews in the broader world for the first time. You have Jews dealing with the major empires of the world. They really went out into the world as Jews, and when they returned to Jerusalem 70 years later, they brought all of that new perspective with them. And you have what's called Second Temple Judaism. They rebuilt the temple. But they couldn't rebuild it the same way because they were not the same people. They were trying to take into account the idea that their God was not just the God of Israel, it was the God of the whole world. And they knew this was true because they had been in the world for the first time. But that led to just, again, more contradictions within the faith. And the Second Temple Judaism has some of the most amazing books of the Bible, of the Old Testament, where, again, if you look at them one at a time and compare them to each other, they do not add up. You have Ezra, who was saying that everybody who was Jewish had to divorce their non-Jewish wife and lead a strictly Jewish life. And against Ezra, you have the book of Ruth, which is a book about a non-Jewish person who marries a Jewish person. And not only is that a good thing, but it's celebrated to the extent that Ruth is given the honor of being the grandmother of King David. So on the one hand, you have people saying only Jews can marry Jews. On the other hand, you're saying, look at Ruth. You have the book of Job. Job, again, is a book not about Jews of Judea. Job is someone who doesn't even live in Judea. It's an ancient book of wisdom that made its way into the Jewish faith. You have the book of Jonah that we read every year at Yom Kippur. One of our holiest days, we read a book about a Jewish prophet, Jonah, who is going into the broader world and is told by God, you have to give yourself to all of these non-Jewish people. It was a very non-national idea, a very global idea, a very universalizing idea. And again, this really came about as a result of the fall of the temple in Jerusalem and the melding of that kingdom into the broader empires of the world. So these are all political facts, these are all historical facts, and they have profound consequences for the faith. You can continue on from Second Temple in Jerusalem to the fall of that temple, to the collapse of the Jewish kingdom. You go on to post-kingdom Judaism. You have the rabbis of the Talmud, who were very consciously adapting Judaism to a world where there was no Jewish kingdom. And again, that was supposed to wipe out Judaism as a religion, but the rabbis refused to let it do so. They adapted it, they changed some of their beliefs, they modernized their faith, and they made it adapt to a brand new world. We call it pivoting these days, when companies or corporations change their way of doing things to meet new challenges. Judaism has always responded and reacted to historical events by doing exactly that, by pivoting. And this continues into really the modern era, continued in the post-Talmudic era. There was something called the Karaite Schism, which we really don't think very much about. Karaites were a sect of Jews, and this was around the time of the rise of Islam, so 700, 800. It was an incredibly large movement. The numbers of Jews who became Karaites was a huge number. And the Karaites rejected the rabbis. The Karaites thought that the rabbis were modernizing too much, and that they couldn't be trusted. Kenny's telling me I need to speak up. The Karaites really were sort of the fundamentalists of their day, and there was a real conflict between the Karaite movement and what was then Rabbinic Judaism, where the rabbis were the ones who were progressive. You could call them the the liberals of their day. They were really trying consciously to adapt and to keep things moving. The Karaites did not like that. It was the rabbinic tradition that survived. The Karaite movement does still exist, but it's much smaller than it used to be. It actually makes an appearance in this book because some Karaites did live in Russia, and they eventually became so disassociated from Judaism that, for instance, Hitler did not persecute the Karaites. He became convinced that they were not Jews, so they were not persecuted by the Nazis. So this goes on and on. In the Middle Ages, Judaism reacted to the history going on around them by, on the one hand, developing an intellectual approach to their faith through Maimonides and all of the people that Maimonides influenced, very intellectual and very academic. And on the other hand, you have the mysticism of the Middle Ages, which was almost the mirror opposite of Maimonides' intellectual approach, where the Jews, very much influenced by Christianity and other religions, sort of looked into their own religion and found sources of mysticism, which had sort of floated around before, but they really came to fruition in the Middle Ages. And the big crisis that happens at a certain point, around 1600 or so, is you have a failure of what you could call normative Judaism or traditional Judaism, a failure of that to meet people's needs. People were not content with what they had anymore. It was not able to grapple with scientific advances. It wasn't able to grapple with the social changes of its day. And that led to a disaster. It led to the rise of a man named Sabbatai Tzvi. Sabbatai Tzvi claimed to be the Messiah. And again, this is something that we don't speak about very much because I think, quite frankly, we're by and large embarrassed by him. He was a disaster. He said he was the Messiah. He changed a lot of rules. He said we didn't have to follow the Torah anymore because he was the Messiah, so therefore he could tell you that enough was enough. There were a lot of theories about him as a person. People think that he was mentally ill. People think he was bipolar. He went on manic phases. He was apparently, by all accounts, a very dynamic individual. The number of people who followed Sabbatai Tzvi is astonishing. And there's a lot of work done on him by different scholars. He was more than popular. He really took over a large amount of European Jewry. That fell apart, that fell to pieces, and Jews were left basically with the fact that their religion was no longer making sense. The guy who told them that their Messiah turned out to be a fraud. And what happened then? Well, three things happened, and we live with them today. Number one was the Reform movement, which broadly called the Reform movement, which really welcomed into the Jewish faith all the social advances, all the scientific advances, all the learning that had taken place to that point. A very critical view of things. That's the Reform movement. Another child of the Sabbatean movement is the Hasidic movement. Again, based on the idea that regular Judaism wasn't working for people, the Hasidic movement came about. That was led by a man who's known as the Baal Shem Tov. He was a rabbi from Carpathia, I believe, in that area of Eastern Europe. And again, he was moving away from the rote Judaism of his fathers. He was moving away from the idea that all you have to do is follow these rules and you'll be okay. People weren't happy with that anymore. So the Baal Shem Tov took things in another direction. The Hasidic movement still exists today. It has changed a lot. It has become a deeply conservative movement. It has really, in many ways, melded with the Orthodox movement, basically because the Reform movement has presented it with such an overpowering opposition that the Orthodox and Hasidic movements have sort of combined. In the beginning, they were not combined. In the beginning, the Orthodox and the Hasidic movements were very opposed to each other. The Orthodox movement found the Hasidic movement to be a real threat to it. And the third thing that happened really is the growth of the Orthodox movement itself, because it's really in the past few hundred years that you had a movement like Orthodox Judaism with a sense of finality, the concreteness about its dogmas. That is really a brand new thing in Judaism. The Orthodox present themselves as being something that has always been that way. My read of this is different. My read of it is that Orthodox Judaism that we have today itself is very much a response to the world around it, a response, in other words, to history, to the events that really happened in the past few hundred years. And these relationships, Orthodox to Reform and Reform to Hasidism, That's another huge subject of this book, is these Jews are just arguing with each other constantly about what their faith is and what their faith could be. None of them agree with each other. They all have slightly different versions, and they're all valid, because that's another wonderful thing about Judaism, is you really cannot ever say that the other person's Judaism is wrong and yours is the only right one. It doesn't work that way. So that is some of the reasons why I put this book in Russia, and I put it in the 1920s. I really wanted to bring it close to the schism between Reform and Hasidism. I really wanted to show Hasidism as a live thing, not just an ossified tradition, but as something that really was still flowing through history. And to do that, I had to put it back a few years. So, now that I've raced you through literally 3,000 years of Jewish history, and I think my rabbi friends are both having miniature coronaries at this point, and I can only repeat that there are billions of words that you can spend on these topics, and that's one of the wonderful things about it, is there's no end to it. Once you start going down these paths, there's no end to what you learn and what's interesting and what really sheds light on your own life and your own circumstances. Putting that aside, I know that some of you also are interested in the role that art played in the story, because as everybody has pointed out to me, it's about a black square. And that seems strange to people, that there's a black square at the heart of this book. So why would I be writing about art? First of all, because if you're writing about Russia in 1926, surprisingly enough, art really matters. Art was a huge thing. Now, we think art, why would anybody care about art? But art, in the broad sense, is how you present things. It's communication, and it's the theory of communication is always a theory of art. And if the Soviets were interested in anything, the Soviets were interested in how to communicate with people. They were big on that. And so art in Russia was not only an important thing, it was a political thing, it was of great moment, and people argued about it, fought about it, and probably people got killed for it eventually. I wouldn't be surprised given how things turned out. So if I had not written about art, and I was writing about Russia in the 1920s, there would have been a lack in the book. There would have been a hole there that would have had to be filled in somehow. So that's one reason. Another reason I wanted to write about art was because, well, if you're talking about Jewish history, art plays a role there as well. And, Judaism is not known for its representational art. There was sort of not a law, but there was a disfavoring of representational art in Judaism for centuries and centuries. So you have all these beautiful Christian artworks in the Middle Ages, for instance, and there are no Jewish companions to them. There aren't any beautiful portraits of Moses that are painted by a Jew. They're all painted by Italians. And it's because Jews didn't do that kind of thing. But it is mistaken to think that Jews were not concerned about art. Again, it's part of our lives. It's part of everybody's lives. And there are three strands that are important when reading this book to keep in mind. One is really just the Hasidic strand. Hasidism in Russia, in Poland, in Ukraine was very much a country religion. Less so in Poland. Warsaw was a heavily Hasidic city, but in Russia it was really a country phenomenon. And the country is filled with superstitious people, and superstitious people were very fond of talismans. You had a lucky thing in your pocket. And the Hasidim, being country folk for the most part, had their lucky things. So that's something that I was playing with, like what would be a true talisman for a Hasidic Jew of this day? What really would be meaningful to them? Another thing that I was tying into that is what I was talking about earlier about the Middle Ages and that strand of mysticism. There is a strand of mysticism in Judaism, not so much popular as highly esoteric, but it's the concept of what's called Ein Sof. I'm not going to go into what Ein Sof is, because again, that is a huge topic, but it's part of the Kabbalah, which is the study of Jewish mysticism, and it concerns the meaning of emptiness. It concerns the meaning of a void. It concerns finding meaning where there is no meaning. It means it's concerning finding something there in the darkness, essentially. And that is a profound study, and you can take that in many different directions. One of the directions you can take it in is by contemplating the black square. And when you take it into practical terms, terms, what a black square really is. You know, when you look at a Torah scroll, the Torah is where Jews, we keep them in this art here. When you look at a Torah scroll, that's where Jews find their law, that's where we find our sacred books, some of our sacred books at any rate. What you're really looking at is ink on a page. That is what it is. It is ink on a page. And I think a scribe, a person who writes that ink, would be very, very aware of the fact that it is ink on a page. And so that black square, which was painted by a scribe, again, it's invested with the meaning of a scribe who's writing letters, ink, on the parchment of the Torah. So that was another aspect of the artistic thing in this book. And third, and I wish that Ruth would speak with me. Ruth is an artist, much more than I am, much more accomplished. But there was that revolution in modern art that was taking place at around the same time, where painters, not Jews, but painters became aware of the fact that a painting is paint. This, again, was a brand new thing in the world. You were not painting a picture of something and saying, look at this flower. You were painting colors on a canvas and saying, look at the colors on that canvas. Look at the paint on that canvas. Look at the fact that it's paint. This was a self-conscious thing. This was a revolutionary thing. It has basically taken over the world of painting and many other arts as well, this self-consciousness. But yeah, the idea that painting is not representational, that painting is paint. And if you want to know the meaning of the painting, you look at the meaning of the paint. What's the meaning of the paint if it's a black box? Well, if you're looking at a black box that was painted by a Torah scribe who is aware of the idea of the value of emptiness, and who also has this sense that if I paint this object will become a talisman for people to hold that they will value, those things all come together, and they all come together in this book. And it was just too much fun to want to put them together and make it part of this book. And by the way, this book has more than just the black square. If you're looking for emptinesses, if you're looking for the other types of black squares, you see it. The book talks about the Talia Shevka velvets, the synagogue, the old synagogue in Talia Shevka. They each have an ark like this one, where the Torah scrolls are held, and that the temple, the synagogue in the little town of Talia Shevka was very proud of the fact that they had a different ark cover for each of the holidays. They would take them out for each of the holidays. It would be a big thing, a very festive thing that they were very proud of. And one for a holiday that they talk about in this book, a summertime holiday commemorating a sad holiday, commemorating the fall of the temple in Jerusalem, was all black. It was a portrait of mourning, essentially. So you have the Talia Shevka velvets in this book, again, a black square. You have it in the letter that the Talia Shevka rabbi keeps. That's another thing that's in the book. It's a mythic thing from the past that an ancient rabbi had written this letter, and they buried it. They've hidden it away because they were afraid of it being stolen or destroyed. What is the content of that letter? That's another black box, really. And you even have it in one of the characters, Chava, the young woman. You have it in her bobbed hair. She has black bobbed hair, and she's very conscious that her hair itself is an artistic expression. You know, she's the one who runs the art gallery. She's the one who knows all about modernist art, and for her, this is a fun thing. So, again, the confluence of these things was just too much fun for me to pass up in writing this book. Hence the art angle of this book, which is, after all, to remind you about chasing the divine in your life. One other thing that you'll note as you read through the book, if you read it, every character who talks about that black square, it sees something totally different in it. And they all, every town they go to, every new person that they meet when they're tracing down this art, they think it means something different. Every person sees something different in it, and one of the funny things, of course, is that they're all right. Every single one of these people sees something different, and everything that they see in it is completely valid. It just means different things to different people, different things at different times, and if that's not a representation of the divine, then it's hard to imagine anything else that would be. Everything in this book really is in flux. It's a portrait of things in flux. The art is in flux, the religion is in flux, the politics is in flux, the people's lives are in flux, except for one thing. There's only one thing that is not in flux, and that is the divine spark at its core, which is something that not only never changes, but is also never caught. You can never capture it. It can never be in your possession. It's always just out there. So it was great fun to write about and to consider art. as a subject. So that's about art. I promised you also that I would say a few words about writing in general, and this is a little off topic because it's not just about The Hunter. But one question that I've often asked, and I should just answer it once and for all, is have I tried to get these books of mine published? Or do I choose to self-publish them? Well, I've tried pretty hard, and I've come pretty close. A couple of times I've had certain interests expressed, things like that, but it's never come to fruition. And for you, my friends, I have no excuses for that failure. I am sure that my books would be better with a professional's editing hand. Very little doubt of that. Maybe they wouldn't be. They would probably be less idiosyncratic. They would probably be a little bit less personal. To some extent, they might be less interesting, but they'd be more polished and more exciting to read. I don't know. I may never know. Sadly for me, writing is one of those things with a binary success meter. You're either published or you're not. I feel that keenly, and I apologize to all of you for inflicting my words on you when the experts in Manhattan have all decided that they're not worthwhile. I can only take comfort myself in the idea that most books, in fact, most works of art, really are failures. We never get on the page exactly what we're looking for. Try as we might. It's never as good, it's never as perfect as what we have in our minds. I do try, but I am aware that I fall short. And in that regard, I want to leave you with some words, not by myself, but by a better writer. His name is Joseph Conrad. He's not Jewish, he was a Pole who wrote in English. He was a sea captain, actually, who came to writing later in life and wrote a number of masterpieces. But this is what he had to say about the subject, and I apologize to my friend Caroline because I read this to her the other day for practice. This is what Joseph Conrad says. Sometimes, stretched at ease in the shade of a roadside tree, we watch the motions of a laborer in a distant field, and after a time begin to wonder languidly as to what the fellow may be at. We watch the movements of his body, the waving of his arms. We see him bend down, stand up, hesitate, and begin again. It may add to the charm of an idle hour to be told the purpose of his exertions. If we know he is trying to lift a stone, to dig a ditch, uproot a stump, we look with more real interest at his efforts. We are disposed to condone the jar of his agitation upon the restfulness of the landscape, and even if in a brotherly frame of mind, we may bring ourselves to forgive his failure. We understood his object, and after all, the fellow has tried, and perhaps he had not the strength, perhaps he had not the knowledge. We forgive, go on our way, and forget. So it is with the workman of art. Art is long, life is short, and success is very far off. And thus, doubtful of the strength to travel so far, we talk a little about the aim of art, which, like life itself, is inspiring, difficult, and obscured by mists. It is not in the clear logic of a triumphant conclusion. It is not in the unveiling of one of those heartless secrets which are called the laws of nature. It is not less great, but only more difficult. To arrest, for the space of a breath, the hands busy about the work of the earth, and compel men entranced by the sight of distant goals to glance for a moment at the surrounding vision of form and color, of sunshine and shadows, to make them pause for a look, for a sigh, for a smile. Such is the aim, difficult and evanescent, and reserved only for a very few to achieve. But sometimes by the deserving and the fortunate, even that task is accomplished, and when it is accomplished, behold, all the truth of life is there, a moment of vision, a sigh, a smile, and the return to an eternal rest. That is Joseph Conrad, who is certainly probably more worth reading than I am. He's a great writer. So that is what I have to say to you folks about my book. I also have some questions that Kenny was kind enough to provide me up front, and I will do my best to answer these questions. And if anybody has any other questions to add to them, I'm more than happy to address those as well. So the first question from Kenny in the book club is, in the Book of Order, which is the last book I wrote, Michael said he was the wood person, quote unquote. The wood person was a character in that book. He really wasn't the wood person, he was the wood rover, which which was the rabbi of Woodrow Avenue. It was a character in that book. And I really wasn't so much the Woodrower Kenny as I was just the person who wrote his lines. I don't know if I really was anybody.
That was Benea's question.
Okay. But
She
unfortunately,
didn't come tonight because actually she was sick, but
yeah. Well, does Michael see himself as the American scouting film sites in this book? One of the characters is an American who's in Russia trying to find a place to make a film. If not, does he see himself in this book? Which character is it and why? It's an interesting question. I think all writers of fiction are asked that. So it's nice of you to ask me that because you're pretending that I'm a writer of fiction. If I'm anybody in this book, I would say that there is somebody in this book who is a scribe, who paints a black box that everybody is wondering about, trying to find, locate, and understand, and nobody ever finds him or the black box. And his name is Moshe, which is my Hebrew name, as Kenny knows because he sees me at services often enough. So there is a bit of me in Moshe, and he is a character in the book who really isn't even in the book. And as an aside, I would also say there is a character just mentioned early on. He's not even in the book, but this is the fun you have when you're writing. There's a guy who shows up one time and disappears. His name is Mikhail Natanovich, which is Russian for Michael, son of Nathan, which is, of course, me, Michael, son of Newton. So again, that was just me being sly, me having some fun as they're writing. A second question from Kenny in the book club. Who was being hunted in the story? How many people do you think were being hunted in the book? And Kenny asked that, or somebody asked that, because the name of the book is The Hunter of Talia Shevka. So one of the things that I would tell you, Kenny, is that if you look, you will find, and there actually is an answer to that in the book itself, when they are wandering through the woods looking for their lost horses, and everybody pairs off, and you have just a series of conversations between different people. And one of the conversations is between the doctor and David. David is a young student who is along for the ride. The doctor is an older gentleman who is a physician by trade. And David has climbed a tree. And he's just up in a tree at some point. They can't find the horses, and David just makes himself comfortable by climbing the tree. And the doctor asks him, "Why did you climb that tree?" "Here I'll have the joy of quoting myself." David replies, "To get more distance between my body and our pursuers." The doctor says, "What pursuers?" Because at that point, they don't know that the Russian secret police are after them. You know that as the reader, but they don't know that themselves. And David replies, "I don't know. But we are pursuing Chava's brother, who himself is pursuing Moshe the scribe. Moshe the scribe is pursuing the rabbi of Talia Shevka, and the rabbi of Talia Shevka is pursuing God in heaven. Do you honestly believe that we represent the end of that equation, or is it far more likely that we two are simply in the middle of it?" To which the doctor replies wisely, "Is there room on that branch?" Because he realizes, they're in the middle of it. Everybody's being hunted, and everybody is hunting. That seems to be the way of the world. So the next question for them is, Chava's clerk, Sonia Borisovna, says to Colonel Kamen in the gallery, the art gallery, about the painting of the little black square, "It asks nothing more than to exist. It asks no more than to have people look and feel. It is an honest work. It glorifies the people. It trusts each person to have a soul connected to a larger soul. In this square is the tie that binds." This is a ballerina talking to a Secret Service officer, trying to explain why this work of art that they're all interested in is not subversive. She's trying to protect herself. She's trying to protect her boss, who is Chava, who's out chasing down the black square, and her brother. So what is the significance of this passage? The significance of this passage is this is a young woman who's trying to explain why there is beauty in this painting of a black square. And I think that, I'd have to go back and see, but I think that's the first person who talks about the black square as a painting and what the value is. Everybody they meet talks about it in a different way. And everybody, the beadle of the shoal says, the guy was an idiot, he was a fool, he was just painting the ark cover, that's all he did. And maybe he's right, he was just painting the ark cover. As I say, everybody has a different thing to say about it, and everybody's thoughts, I think, are valid in that book. So, and there's a follow-up, how the heck did this woman come up with this interpretation of the little black painting? I don't know, she just did it. Characters take on lives of their own, and I find that pretty much everybody is interested in things that would surprise you. And in the book, she's a ballerina, her life is really centered on art. And for her, dance and painting are two sides of the same coin, which I believe so too. I think all arts are related. Let's see, what was your goal in creating this painting and the story of this little black square? I think I've talked about that for forever. Let's see, this is a good question. Weintraub says to Dr. Seidman when walking Natalia Shevka, and what do thimbles and measuring tape have to do with the spirit of the Besht? Everything, says Seidman. So Seidman is the doctor, and Weintraub is the American who's there, going through the countryside with them. And they're chatting about different aspects of life and what's going on and why they're doing what they're doing. And the doctor has mentioned that his grandfather was a tailor. And the doctor is a very successful, I would call him a modern Jew, an assimilationist, if you want to call him that. He has a very nostalgic view of Judaism. For him, it's not so much something that he practices, but it's meaningful to him, and he always has in mind his grandfather's faith. He says, actually, in that same conversation, that when I'm doing surgery and when I'm sewing up somebody's body, I think of my grandfather sewing with needle and thread. And he honors his grandfather, and he doesn't look down on his grandfather for being religious, for being a tailor. He sees his skills as being the same as his grandfather's. He just happens to be a doctor, whereas his grandfather was a tailor. If that's not an American story, I don't know what it is. It happens to be a Russian story as well. So there's that, where the doctor is really talking about his grandfather and how much he loved his grandfather. But there is something deeper there. And I would say that has to do with the Hasidic thought, the Hasidic tradition in Russia and in general. What the Besht did in the beginning of things was to take a whole new look at what brings meaning to the Jewish faith. Because normative Judaism was very scholarly, very academic, and there was a sense that if you were poor and you worked for a living and you could not afford to study texts all day, that you weren't as good a Jew as somebody who did. The Besht turned that on its head. The Besht said the most important thing was not sitting and studying a book in a room. The most important thing was to have the Spirit of God with you wherever you were. And if you were poor and you were working and you were in the field, if you have the Spirit of God with you, that is better than being a scholar. And he put that front and center in his faith. And it was a beautiful thought. It was a revolutionary thought. It had a huge amount of influence on the Jews of his day and to the Jews of us today. And that thought has become basically embedded, I think, in how we think of Judaism. It was the Besht who did that. And again, Simon was saying that needle and thread is everything. And that, again, if you want to take it a step further, not only is needle and thread everything, but paint is everything. If you're a painter, then your paint is what's important. And that, again, reinforces the theme of the book, that this paint, this black square, is really something, it's not just a black square, it's something extra. So it reinforces the theme of the book, but it's a fun conversation. So the next question is, what does Sasha in the tavern mean when he says, this is a quote from one of the characters, Sasha, "Oh, you Jews, you live like rabbits in your holes in the ground, you live like rabbits, you eat lettuce, you run from dogs, and you drink kefir." That's a Russian talking about Jews, and Sasha is a very complicated character. As you read through the book, he becomes really a fascinating character and almost the linchpin of the whole story. But at that point in time, they're all just thinking of him as their minder. They have a minder as they go through the countryside because they've been assigned somebody from the foreign ministry who has to keep an eye on them. And it's Sasha. He has no interest in his job. He's just there because it's his job. But he's having a laugh. He's having a laugh at their expense. And of course, what was the response to that in the book? It's like, yeah, we do like kefir, which is true. Kefir's wonderful stuff.
I've got some in my refrigerator.
Yeah. Catherine loves kefir. Nathaniel can't get enough of it. So another question is, one of the beauties of this book is a kind question. You were referring to the pogroms of 1905, 1919, 1926. You talk about the whites, the Poles, the Reds, the Cossacks, the Black Hunters. They're in the foreboding backdrop of this book. You were able to paint this picture without going into the gory violence and the terror. What are your thoughts? Why did you craft it like this in the book? I couldn't write a pogrom. I could try to write a pogrom. It wouldn't be very convincing because I've never lived through a pogrom. I've read about pogroms. I've read the history of pogroms. But my life has not been led with knowledge of a pogrom. And I didn't really feel like I could write convincingly about a pogrom. But But I could write convincingly about some guys wandering through a town talking about the program that happened 20 years ago, because, you know, that's what Jews do. So we still talk about the programs that happened, you know, 100 years ago, because they're very real to us. We live with the consequences of them, we live in their shadow to some degree, and that is something that is real. So again, I'm not writing about the pogroms, I'm not writing about the revolution, I'm writing about a very quiet time in Russian history. It was, all the dramatic stuff was over, the Civil War was over, the Second World War hadn't started yet, Stalin had not taken control yet, we were still in the later stages of Lenin. Lenin actually has just died in this book, so they haven't figured it out yet. It's a very flexible, strange time. And again, I put it in that time for all the reasons that I discussed. Let's see. The next question is, the old rabbi of Talyashevka, who Frida talks about, was a student of Bershad. Please explain the significance of that. So that's a wonderful question. Bershad was a school of Hasidic thought. And Hasidic thinking, you know, starts with the Besht, and from there on it develops from one rabbi to another. And all these different rabbis had different takes on what was important. All these different rabbis really had some fundamental disagreements with each other about how people should react and how people should live. Bershad was one such rabbi. He was a rabbi of the early times who had some fairly progressive ideas, I would say. He talked about, again, the importance of simplicity. He really was underlining that part of the Besht thinking. And by the time he was around, which I think was a couple of generations after the Besht, Hasidim were already moving away from that. And he was a reminder, it was sort of a gentle reminder that we still need to be simple. We still need to prize simplicity in life. I think, I was careful in the book as much as possible to explain things as I went along. If I wrote, you know, the Rabbi Bershad, honestly, if you look 20 pages before that, there will be some discussion of the Rabbi of Bershad and what that means. And I think the example I gave in that book was the Rabbi Bershad taught his students that his pipe was important to him as the Torah. They both brought him peace. So you think of a rabbi today saying, you know, oh, you have your pipe, that's as important as reading this book. Hard to imagine, but that's what a Hasidic rabbi did in 1750. So to say that the Talyashevka rabbi was a student of Bershad is really placing him within the context of a certain strand of Hasidic history that was a very liberal, progressive strand of it. Let's see. Frida says, it is good to be in the country again and to take some fresh air. And just to explain for those of you who haven't read the book starts in the city of Kiev, the big city. The people go to the countryside, they go to the small town of Talyashevka. From Talyashevka, they go even further into the countryside, and they're wandering through the woods, and they're going eventually in a little village. They get further and further and further away from the big city and further into the countryside where they're looking for what they're looking for. So Frida says, it's good to be in the country again and take some fresh air. It makes me feel like a Jew again. It makes me feel young. What is she referring to? I have no idea. Frida just says things like that. Frida is just a wonderful character. And I'm going to combine that with the next question. Frida becomes a key character because she fills in a lot of the blanks about how Talyashevka was decimated in the past. What was your thinking behind inserting her into the story? Frida is one of my favorite characters in the book. She's an older woman, and she lives in the town of Talyashevka. When she's introduced, you think, oh my God, this fuddy-duddy, this woman from the countryside, she's just old-fashioned, she's silly, she's somewhat comical. And the young woman, Chava, who's completely urban, citified, so sophisticated, I mean, they look at each other and they're like from different species. And they end up becoming incredibly close. They end up having a very special bond in the book. They end up really seeing into each other and understanding each other and grasping the essence of who each other are. They're wonderful characters to write about, and it was a real fun feature of the book was that particular relationship between the older woman and the younger woman in the country and the city, and seeing what they had in common, I think was key. The role that Frida played in the book was she represented a very specific type of observational Judaism, a Jew, an old-fashioned Jew who really was still an old-fashioned Jew. And if you look at all the other characters in the book, you have the rabbi, himself, who is a rabbi. You have the doctor, who is fully assimilated. You have David, who's half and half, the student, David has all the traditions and knows all the lore, but he stands apart from it. I mean, he was a Bolshevik. He did things during the war that are almost unthinkable. Yet here he is, believing Jew. You have his friends, the artist friend who is just having fun. I mean, he's Jewish, but he's not really Jewish, but he's Jewish because how can he not be? But he's an artist, and he thinks of himself as an artist first. And he ends up teaching a cheder class. He ends up teaching little Jewish kids about art, and that's the last you see of him. Everybody has a different idea of what it is to be Jewish, and everybody's idea is their own. Frida just represents a very specific type of Jew that, I think of my grandmother, and how she felt about her Judaism. It was so simple. It was not self-conscious. It was a beautiful thing. She lived and breathed it in a way that I wish I could. I envy it so much. And Frida had that. And that's what she's saying. It's like, I'm breathing air. The air must be Jewish air because I have Jewish lungs. It makes her happy to feel that way. And I think a lot of Jews do feel that way. It's a beautiful feeling. The character, okay, that next question gives away too much, so I can't answer it. If there's one theme you would like to impart to the reader, what would it be? It would be, buy the book and find out. Yeah, so that's really it for the questions that the book club had for me. Does anybody here have any questions about the book or about anything I've said that I can respond to? There's a question.
I was just going to ask, setting the book in 1926 is interesting. You mentioned that it's a somewhat quiet period of time for these villages, etc. But it's an inflection point in history. It's following, I think, that risen to power even before that after Clement passed away. And I don't know how quickly things turn around, but I've only gone halfway. Forgive me if I got not got the answer to this, but I felt uncomfortable seeing all the internecine conflict between the different branches of Judaism that was about to happen in children for years.
So fortunate, yeah. I mean, that's the unwritten coda to the book. Is if you look at what happened in history, these people don't survive. The American survives, probably ended up in Hollywood writing screenplays or something like that, but I think everybody else would have been killed. The Soviet officers probably would have died before the war. They were Trotskyites, so they would have been taken in by Stalin and corrected in that fashion. And I think it's just a truth that the Jews disagreed with each other so profoundly. There's talk about Zionism. These people think Zionism was for the birds. For the most part, they didn't really believe in that. But that's the way things were. So again, I was just trying to be true to that facet of things. And I think it's how things are today as well. I mean, when you look at how American Jews are, the solid line that divides the Reform from the Orthodox is something that grieves me. It's again, I think it's very sad. I think it's very much a function of history, but it is unfortunate. I mean, you look at what's happening in Israel and the role that the fundamentalists play in Israeli politics. It's astonishing. It's a problem, and it was a problem then too. So again, writing about 1926, I was really writing about current events.
I guess they've always had traditions for a couple thousand years. So
Yeah, exactly. There is nothing new under the sun. Uh-oh, here comes trouble.
First of all, congratulations. I don't think I could give no lecture for 15 minutes without pausing, having a drink of water, and being very, very, very aware of every habit that I don't see you using it, and really having a great self-confidence about what you were saying. You've written several books that I've been privileged to look at a little bit and know about others. What's your next book? Are you writing one now?
That is forbidden information.
Aww.
Isaac Babel, who is mentioned in this book, Isaac Babel was a Russian Jewish writer back in the 1920s. People always like to ask him what he was writing about, and he always said the same thing. He said, I'm writing about goats. Goats. Because he didn't like to answer that either. So I'll tell you I'm writing about goats. Once you talk about what it is, then it becomes set in a certain way, and if it becomes set in a certain way, then you can't change it. And if you can't change it, then you're really in trouble because you need to be able to keep everything flexible. So I don't talk about what I'm writing about. But thank you for the question.
Are you writing another one?
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh yeah. In your copious free time.
Yeah, that's what I do. So thank you for that question. Does anybody else have any concerns?
One of our esteemed Goffstown librarians.
Thank you, Doug. In the book on page 206, you have David, I think, saying, "It seems to me that religion, like art, is subject to broad social trends." That really stuck out to me as a theme of this book. And I was wondering what effect those broad social trends of today are having on Judaism, specifically the rise of individualism, the impending climate crisis, and now the coronavirus.
The corona is too early to say what effect that has had on things, but as for the other things, that's what I was talking about early on. Judaism has always really been shaped by what's happened around it. I think it's a mistake to think that it hasn't been. I think it's a mistake to think that it shouldn't be. I think that people are working very hard to figure out how those things play into Judaism. I mean, as far as environmentalism goes, there's a beautiful long tradition in Judaism of true environmentalism. I mean, going all the way back to the Mosaic Law, where you are told a sacred rule that you have to give your fields a rest and you have to give your animals a rest and things like that. There's a real respect for the earth, and that's an ancient belief. And I think that there's a lot of very fruitful work that you can do bringing that into today's debates. The rise of individualism is a huge problem for, I think, every religion, because people are less and less liable to listen to authorities. Everybody wants to think for themselves. That has a long and I think illustrious history within the Jewish faith, the critical idea. And it's not just Maimonides in the Middle Ages who brought the critical idea into the faith, but you go back to the Talmud, you go back all the way. One of my favorite stories from the Old Testament, and I'm sorry to quote the Old Testament again, I've got two rabbis in the audience, so I'm on thin ice, but there's a guy named Korah in the Old Testament who challenges Moses. He says, why is Moses so special? We're just as good as Moses, so why don't we lead the people? And in the Old Testament, of course, the ground opens up and swallows him. That's what happened to Korah. But it is very hard not to feel sympathy for Korah from the modern viewpoint, because we're all like Korah right now. We're all sort of saying a very similar thing. And we've been doing that for a really long time. I mean, Reform movement, the movement that we call the Reform movement is just really the latest Reform movement. The first Reform movement was Korah. It didn't go too well. But there was another one right after him, and another one right after that, and another one right after that. So the rise of the individual and all of the things that come with it is something that we can grapple with. And I think that is something that we can grapple with successfully because it is already so much part of our DNA. I don't feel it's an existential threat to this faith. I think it's just another challenge, and I think it's one that can and is being met. But thanks, that's a good question. Ruth, you have to have a question.
I have a question and a comment. When you gave your overview of Jewish history, which I totally appreciated, I must say, it was fascinating. And I love seeing things like that in broad outline, because it makes things so clear. But I was surprised you didn't say anything about conservative Judaism.
Conservative Judaism to me is an outgrowth of reform. It is, again, it's part of the reform spirit. It partakes of the reform apparatus academically. It is a critical view of the Jewish tradition based on scientific principles and writ broadly. But to me, conservatism and reform are one and the same. So that's probably why I wasn't mentioning conservatives especially. I didn't want to confuse people by adding one more term to what I was saying, because I feel like I was saying quite a bit as I was. But that's the reason why.
No, here we said that conservative.
Yep. And I grew up conservative, and I'm very comfortable in conservative. I don't feel as comfortable in a reform show. I don't feel comfortable in an Orthodox show. This is where I fit in the best.
Exactly.
Yet I know that if I go to a conservative show in a different city, it's going to be completely different, because that's the way conservative Judaism is. I mean, it's every show has its own ethos. So you swim and you float.
The comment I wanted to make was maybe a little hard for me to formulate, but I was surprised to hear you say work, thoughtful work, and I feel that you're doing something extremely important in being part of this, of a movement that stands up to traditional publishing. And I also know that putting together the final steps of going from a manuscript to this is very difficult, and I applaud you for doing it. You know, there's a parallel in music today where people who do beautiful new music or thoughtful new music do not have to go through the traditional music publishers. So you're part of a very important movement, and I mean, I know, I hear your modesty in a sense, but I think it's misplaced.
Well, it's kind of you to say. For you to say it, it is a kindness and it is a welcome thing. For me to say it, it would be very self-serving and probably off base. It's a difficult topic. I accept some of the premise of what you're saying, but there is still that gatekeeping function in the broader population. Whereas if you have a book that's published by Simon & Schuster, people think, oh, you know, somebody read that, thought it was good, so it's probably good. If you have a book that some guy publishes on his own, it's like, no, it's a guy who published it by himself. And so when you're trying to sell your books, people like to have the approval of others before they buy it themselves. Broadly speaking, you know, I tell myself what you're telling me, and I keep writing anyway. It doesn't really affect me, but that's just how I'm built. It's a curious question, and I don't have an answer to it. I know that one of the reasons I love the city of London, oddly enough, here's a tangent for you. I love London for London theatre. And the theatre in London is different from the theatre in New York because it's cheaper. You can go see a wonderful play in London for $20, and if you want to see that play in New York, it costs you $150. And the result of that is that a lot of people go see plays in London. And the result of that is that there are a lot of plays to see in London. And the result of that is that the line between the greatest play and the worst play really doesn't even matter because people just go see plays all the time. And when you're in London and you're going to see a play, and I'm sitting in the audience, I always get the lovely sense that these are my friends putting on a play for me. Because that's what it feels like. It feels very warm. It feels very comforting. And to some extent, you know, what I'm doing is I'm telling a story to my friends. You know, I'm saying, hey, I have a story who wants to listen to it. And that's a beautiful thing. But that doesn't put bread on the table, I'll tell you that. And there are people who really disagree with me about whether these things are worth anything. There's nothing worse than, you know, being in Manhattan and saying, I'm a self-published writer. It's like, oh my God, here's the door. People are not interested in that in the broader sense. You know, it's a good question. I was talking to my friend Elliot the other day about this Andy Warhol, because Warhol had this open door policy at his studio. He called it the factory. And I remember reading many years ago about a guy who came to see him, like a 19-year-old guy, just walks in the door, and Andy Warhol says, who are you? And the guy says, I'm a guy. You know, I'm 19. And Andy Warhol says, well, what are you doing here? He says, I don't know, I like art. And he says, do you do art? He says, well, I want to be a photographer. And Andy said, well, do you have a camera? The guy said, yeah, here's my camera. And he said, well, then you're a photographer. It's a beautiful idea. And that guy hung around the factory and took pictures of the people that Andy Warhol hung around with and was eventually paid for his photographs. So, you know, we live in a capitalist society where if you make money from something, you're legitimate. And if you do it for the love of what you're doing, then you're... People like me used to be called beatniks. I don't know if there's a word for it anymore, but, you know, that's what we are. We're beatniks. We're just doing it because we like the sound of music. That's what it comes down to. But thank you. Thank you for that pleasant thought. Iris is going to make trouble now.
I'll call her down.
In addition to your mastery of writing, you write so eloquently, and I don't think there's a flaw in any of your sentences, but you have also such immense knowledge of religion and history. Do you know when that started to be a part of who you were? Were you very young when you realized
Jewish history really came about because Rosh Hashanah services are so long, and I am not much of a person for praying, but I always make my mother happy by coming to services for Rosh Hashanah. And as our rabbi knows, what I do at services is I sit in the back and I read. And in front of you all, if you have, I don't know if it's in the pews now, but there is that wonderful red book, Eitz Chaim, which is a copy of the Old Testament and some of the prophets, and it has critical writing appended to it. It has all the critical notes, and it has a lot of wonderful essays in the back written by incredibly great scholars. And I would sit and read these essays and sit and read all the critical notes, and they are fascinating. And as I got older, year after year, I would read one that I hadn't read before, I would read one again that I had read before. I was always finding new things, and it's just endless. I mean, it is just a fascinating thing. I mean, literally all of those, when I was going through Jewish history, I was laughing because here I am doing it in 5 minutes. You can spend 5 lifetimes, doing these things, and people do spend their lifetimes doing these things, and it's amazing stuff. One thing that I was going to add, and it didn't really fit into my talk at all, but I'll just add it now. In terms of reading and research and such, if anybody is interested in some other books to read, I would offer 3 for you, which has a very specific value to me in writing The Hunter. One book is a hilarious book, and it's a very unlikely one. It's called 12 Chairs, and it is a Soviet comedy written by a couple of guys in like 1927, I think. And the idea of a Soviet comedy today, it makes no sense, but again, it is a hilarious book. It was a book about these Russian guys running around trying to make money, trying to get by. They're hucksters. They're charming. They're hilarious. It's a genuinely funny book. It's such a funny book that Mel Brooks actually made a horrible movie out of it because he couldn't even come close to getting it on the screen. There have been other movies on it as well. It is a well-loved Russian classic, and I've known people from the Eastern Bloc who were familiar with it. They were always waving it around saying, "You need to read the 12 Chairs." And I would look at it, why would I read that? I actually finally read it because I was trying to do some background on Russia in the 1920s. It's invaluable for that, but as a human document, it's invaluable, just showing exactly how in Soviet Russia these guys were just cutting each other up and just having a ball. It's a great book, a great glimpse of culture that is so unexpected. More seriously, another book that I find incredibly valuable is something called The Art of Biblical Narrative. I think the rabbis probably have heard of it. It's by a guy named Robert Alter. Alter is a guy from Berkeley who has made a name for himself by translating all the books of the Old Testament. And I've read his translations. I'm not crazy about them, actually. He translates them in a very modern way, so he tries to make them readable and also very true to the source material. And whether he succeeds or not, I don't know, because my Hebrew was non-existent. But this is a book he wrote early in his career, basically about his appreciation of the Bible as literature. He's a Jewish guy, and he's got that in his background, and he knows that, religiously speaking, you don't think of the Bible as literature. But his point is that it is, and not only is it literature, but it is first-class, top-rate, one of the most amazing works in the history of humankind. And what he does, and what I find so valuable, is he again puts things into context. And we always think that these old guys really didn't know as much as we did, that we're much smarter than they are. He points out that, in fact, they were incredibly sophisticated. The level at which they were working, what they were actually doing, what you could see that they were doing, it is beyond modern. It is just genius level stuff. One of the ideas that I got from Alter really was when you read the Old Testament, one of the cheapest criticisms of the Old Testament is that it doesn't make sense. Like the stories contradict each other. There's 2 stories about Adam and Eve. Like one was that Adam gave up a rib, the other one was that Eve showed up in some other fashion, and they put them right next to each other. And I remember when I was a kid, you get sort of little kid cynics saying, "Look at that makes no sense, the Bible is stupid." And you think, "Oh my God, the Bible's stupid, this is a disaster." What Alter says is that the Bible's not. These guys weren't stupid, they knew what they were doing. The person who put those stories together completely realized that the stories were not adding up to one story. What he was doing was taking 2 traditions, people loved both traditions, so he included both of them, and people knew what he was doing. People knew that these were separate traditions. People knew that they were both valuable, and they accepted them as separate traditions that both had value. And it's as if the writers expected you to be able to process that in your mind in real time. Like, of course, these are two different stories, because these people from this area say this story, and our cousins say another story. We don't know which one is right. We'll put them both in. You don't have to make sense of them, because it doesn't matter. And he portrays this really as almost like a sort of literary cubism. And you think of Picasso's paintings and how he's showing one face from different perspectives in a two-dimensional platform. And that's what they were doing with literary themes. They were cubists. And that is just a beautiful thought. So that's the kind of thing that Alder talks about. And the other book, which I find just invaluable for all sorts of reasons, is Martin Buber's collection of Hasidic tales. I've mentioned that before. Any book that I write is going to borrow a lot from Martin Buber. He was a philosopher back in the 1920s, 1930s. He lived a long time. So I think he died finally in the 60s. But he was the first person who went and collected the old Hasidic tales and gave them academic respect. He was saying, these are not just folk tales. These are not just silly stories that our country cousins tell each other. These are profound glimpses of philosophy, and they're of great value. And he collected them all. He's criticized nowadays, of course, because writing in the 1920s, they didn't have the same academic standards that we do, so he updated them and polished them a little bit when he put them into writing. But they remain the books themselves remain a invaluable resource for the early Hasidic thought. And the early Hasidic thought is mind-blowing. It is incredibly beautiful stuff. And I've read that book probably 6 times, cover to cover, and I should probably read it another 6 times because it just rewards repeated viewing. When you're going through a prayer book and you see some neat little thing that you never noticed before, some little story or some little comment, and you think, wow, I wish I'd known that. 9 times out of 10 it comes from that work. And having read that book, you go, oh yeah, the people who wrote the prayer book had this in front of them because this was such good stuff. But they leave out a lot. The stuff they leave out is tremendous. I find that book to be beyond inspiring. It's one of those things that's there. It's inevitable that you run into it when you read this stuff, and it is invaluable. So those 3 books I would recommend to anybody who's interested in any of this material. Any other questions, or have I exhausted all of you? I think we're good. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. We got him for free tonight. I think if in a year or 2, we're probably going to be paying $5,000 for his next appearance with his next book. But anyway, thanks for coming. We have refreshments in the back. Feel free to come back and relax, talk with the author or amongst yourselves. We do most of these book clubs on Zoom. We usually do it like mid-month. The next one's going to be January 12th on Zoom. Rabbi Gary is going to lead us in a book by Ilana Kershan. And she's in Israel, and she made Aliyah years ago and studied the Talmud very completely. And it's a nice book. If anybody ever wants to join us on Zoom or in person, you have my email. Please let me know. Everybody's always welcome. I know some of us are working during the day. We've been doing them at like 4:30 in the afternoon. But anyway, thanks, and thanks for coming.